I started playing when it was 1958. The band was formed, and it was formed by an old BB company. We took the stage in the Ulster Hall like every other band, and we had a reasonable degree of success, but it was never great. In those days, there were, I don't know, many senior bands. I think there could have been 10 in the senior section in the Ulster Hall. You had your Templemores, your Angus Street, your First Old Boys, you had Laganville, you also had Strandtown, you also had a band coming up from Dublin, Steadfast Band, who held their own, and you also had Lisburn Temperance, a few others like that. And the competition then was pretty fierce, but Templemore more or less grabbed the thing. They were a wee school band. They came in and competed their first year, and second section or third section, and then they disappeared, and they come back, bang, into the senior section, and clouded everybody. Alfie Bell was the man. He was ex-army, trained musician, and he certainly knew how to get the best out of the kids, and most of them are still at school. I remember Jean Taylor, she was Jean Savage, Mary John, a whole family were involved, Billy and all the boys. But there were a great bunch of folk, and there's more of the kids now involved in doing their exams and things like that. But only last night we're talking about exams. People do their grades, but the grades only show that you can play 3 pieces, and you can play a certain number of scales, and you can do a wee bit of oral work. It doesn't tell you how good a musician you are. And in some cases the exams are not even, you'll not get a brass person examining the brass player all the time. It could be a choral man, it could be a piano man, and that doesn't always give you the true results. So people are sitting with, oh yes, I've got a grade 8. It means that they can play 3 very difficult pieces and play all their scales, and etc. etc. But it doesn't make them brilliant musicians by any means.
Definitely. How do you think that can be taught into young people?
It's all to do with repertoire. I think if you're taking kids and teaching them in the standard form of, you do your grade 1 this year, you do your grade 2 next year, you have to add more repertoire into that year rather than just sitting playing 3 pieces. That means nothing. And you need to have them with a dozen pieces up their sleeve. Even they're the simplest thing, but they have to be doing more than just the 3 pieces. And the repertoire is important, even for the very young players, and also a lot of sight reading is required. 2 weekends with the Corey boys, they send their team of principals over, and we've done an Easter course, i.e. Friday, Saturday, Sunday morning sort of thing. It's principally pointed at the youth, anybody from 8 years old to 18, and they do a good job, and there's always a concert at the end of it, and demonstrating this is our weekend to work with, this is what we've done. And I think a lot of the young ones look up to the likes of Tom Hutchison and Chris Thomas, and all the top players, Simon Howell. We've had Steve Sykes doing the conducting end of it, course director. Bob Chase couldn't do it, but then, Stevie Sykes is master at it, and he gets on well with the kids. I think it's good in their development, and it's good to let parents see that we are being progressive. Mike Fowells comes over once or twice a year, maybe 3 times. I would talk to him quite often on the phone. and we link up sometimes with the Fowells boys when we were in Armagh summer school and all that sort of stuff. And you're always learning stuff. You're always learning stuff. Summer school in Armagh is a real good thing. There are lots of kids who go to that. We send a minibus, about 20 on it, go every year. And that's Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and the big concerts on Saturday. And that, you know, they learn a lot. And those guys who do come over to do that are experienced in that sort of thing. They're all teaching youth bands, and this is their thing. And Mike Fowells, of course, is a brilliant course director. You can get the maximum out of them all. Okay, thank you for coming. Des Graham, Carrickfergus.
So when I started with Alcorn Street, it was mid-1970s, 77, 78, 79, somewhere around then. And I was completely unaware of bands and contesting and all that sort of stuff. So it was just somebody suggested I could go along with this band. And about 3 weeks later, I found myself sitting on the stage at the Ulster Hall, taking part in the competition. And I think even then, the whole competitive side of brass banding didn't really click with me. It probably took a couple of years for that sort of aspect of it to become apparent. But certainly in those days, I guess there were a lot more people who had grown up and played in bands all their lives. I mean, I was a young player by comparison to everybody else. I would say, you know, even with Downshire, the average age is quite young. And many of the bands, probably the average age is more, you know, younger, middle-aged. Whereas I think a lot of the people, maybe it just seemed that way to me on the street. Everybody seemed really old. And actually getting into the band in those days was a much more formal thing. I had to leave the room when I was being proposed to be a member of the band. And that happened maybe 3 or 4 months after playing with the band. So in a sense, you felt a sense of, you know, privilege getting into this band. Having said that, throughout my time with Alcorn Street, and that was about 6-7 years, maybe 8 years, before I went to England to do my PhD. Otherwise I probably would have carried on. We didn't win that many contests. We were always the bridesmaid, and the dominant band at that stage was Templemore. And ironically, I left Alcorn Street in 1985, and within months of my departure, they won everything in sight for about 10 years. I'd like to believe the two things aren't related, but I mean, in those days it was quite incredible. And just to give you a sense, this is right in the middle of the Troubles, and Alcorn Street practiced in up, I guess, off the Shankle Road, up at Ballysillan School, which doesn't exist anymore. And I was picked up every night for rehearsals by 2 players in the band who lived at Four Winds, and we drove across town, quite often through checkpoints, through diversions, through trouble spots, and went to band. And I guess it meant, I guess it demonstrated an incredible sense of commitment to make that. So I guess in those days it was, I mean, I was in my late teens, mid to late teens, and it was just a real eye-opener. What you don't know when you're involved in those things is just how much your playing improves by playing in a band like that, as opposed to getting individual lessons and so on. I think that's a very complicated, it's an issue with many complicated bits to it. I partly think it's a change, a sort of societal change. I guess the only way to describe this is like a sort of jigsaw puzzle, and you take away any one piece and things less complete. So I think one of them is just general changes of attitudes towards this. A wider variety of leisure activities that people can involve themselves in. I mean, in those days, it was a big deal when the leisure centres opened in Belfast. And yet, going out, you tended to gravitate, particularly during the Troubles, to places where, you had patterns of behaviour and you knew who you were going to be with and what you were going to be doing. That's another piece of the jigsaw. I think in those days, the Western Board, though it still does now, and the South Eastern Educational Library Board had a very vigorous brass band training scheme. And I suppose I partly came up through that, through school, and into the South Eastern Education band at that stage, which was conducted by Jackie Birch. And in those days, I would reckon the standard of that band was annoyingly, for the tutors in the South Eastern Education Library Board, of a much higher musical standard than the orchestra was ever getting to. And yet a lot of those players then went from there to Templemore, to First Old Boys. Some of them are still playing, some of them sadly not. So I think that's another piece of that jigsaw that's meant that the whole base has been, until recently, I guess, sort of eroded a little bit. And I think for a lot of people, I think the bands at the top end now are playing to a higher standard than maybe they were, and therefore there are probably fewer players who are able to make that sort of standard. I sort of, listening back to recordings of Downshire playing, I think we're still relatively new into that top section, but I'm sure we're playing every bit as well now as bands were at that stage. So I think the whole movement has moved on, and what has happened is that as the standard has gone up, people have aggregated towards a smaller and smaller number of bands, so you get the CWA situation of a composite of maybe 5 bands, I think it is, and that includes Agnes Street, so that side of it has become quite decimated. I mean, when I went to England, I was living in the northeast of England, and at one stage for 2 years I was living within a mile and a half of one of the championship section bands in the northeast of England, and it never crossed my mind to go anywhere near it, not once. And that was a really weird thing, to be so close to something that meant so much to me at that stage. And when I came back, a couple of years when I'd been back, I was asked to adjudicate one of the contests here. And I remember when I stood up at the end, having heard the bands, being really impressed, saying something like, how vibrant the band scene seemed to be. I said that in my adjudicator's comments, and somebody took me aside and said, that's not the case. The whole thing is really starting to collapse. And I think that was at a stage before there was any sense of investing time and energy in youth players. I didn't really answer your question, which was, is that the difference now, I guess then? I mean, I don't ever remember there being a time, certainly in my time, where there was a learners class in Agnes Street, so I don't really remember that ever really happening. I mean, interestingly, obviously what Roger Docherty did here at Downshire a long time ago was one of the very first examples of this. And obviously now, I think the whole scene needs more people supporting and helping that movement to grow. I think there's a very good reason why banding works really well for people to get into music. And I think that's why, even at Queen's with the Junior Academy of Music, why we decided that brass was a good way, not just because it's a personal passion, but because there's a very short path between learning the instrument and suddenly sitting in an ensemble with other people making music together. I think that is absolutely critical. you'll not do it quite so easily with strings or woodwind instruments, but you can very quickly get a brass ensemble going. Well, it's, there's a lot of opportunities. What there isn't yet is a national youth brass band of Northern Ireland. Choose my words carefully there. I think that's a shame, because I think there should be more for people who are sort of the 18 to 23 year olds, in such a way that doesn't compromise them in their own band membership, but at least gives them a chance just to stretch their legs a bit more, irrespective of grade. So, I mean, the Armagh Summer School does it to some extent. The initiative that Stephen Crooks has started, very good, in Fermanagh. But I think, more generally, it probably needs a lot more cash injection than it's getting. I mean, the schemes for buying instruments, it's open again, but I mean, the total for that is minuscule. It wouldn't even equip half a youth band, and so there are real problems there. I'm Michael Alcorn, conductor of Downshire Brass and original instigator of the Junior Academy of Music at Queen's, which includes 2 brass bands, and also head of the School of Creative Arts at Queen's University.
Right, well, yeah, I've been coming over since the 70s and used to enjoy it so much, and I used to come back over on the old ferry from Liverpool, overnight ferry. Lovely, get a berth, kipping down, and you wake up when it banged into the dock at Belfast. And a guy called Joe Simpson, he's not with us anymore, but he was the secretary of Northern Ireland Band, flute bands, accordion, it was Northern Ireland Band Association. And it used to be in the Ulster Hall, and all these sections of flute bands, melody flute bands, accordion bands, all these things. And really, to me, it was amazing how busy it was. Of course, it's like everything else, it's come down a bit now. And it was the first time I come across the flute bands, and I was absolutely gobsmacked with them. Really, the standard, when they said, oh, it's the World Flute Band Championship. The reason why it was the World Flute Band, nobody else played flute, nobody else had flute band. But I've never experienced anything as wonderful as a 45-piece flute band. It's the only time I've ever given a band 199, and I think it was Ballyclare Victoria. They used to win it every year for about 9 years, and apparently it's like, well, I was judging down in Armagh earlier this year. And was it this year, last year, anyway? And they said, oh no, and there were about 2 flute bands here, completely lost. It's a bit like England, I do believe at the turn of the last century, the 1900, there was something like 40 to 45,000 brass bands. Yeah, we can't raise 2,000 now. I'm talking over there, and we included Northern Ireland. As you know, just go back and look at the programmes from, say, 20 years ago. The bands have gone down and down, but that's happening everywhere. It's as though the brass bands are not the flavour of the month anymore, as indeed, when you think about it, I don't know, trad bands, traditional jazz bands, there's hardly any about now. It's like big dance bands. I mean, the main thing about that is because expense. But guys who play in big bands now, they do it for their own pleasure. Lovely playing, like with 4 trumpets, 3 trombones, 5 saxes, piano, bass, drums, and guitar. And it's great playing in a band, because I spent quite a bit of time with Sid Lawrence's band, which was, to me, fantastic it was. But it was tying. We would play in Southampton, say tonight, and then Sid would say, right, I'll see you in Newcastle tomorrow. And that was it. We had to get to Newcastle. And then the next Cardiff. And that was okay, but you'd be careful because your marriage was out the window. you know. So, and I jumped out very quickly. But coming back to brass bands, the best bands here don't match the ones over the water. When you get bands like Corey's and Leyland and Fairies and Grimethorpe and Black Dyke, I mean, they're in a league on their own. In fact, I honestly believe that there should be a Premier League with about no more than, in fact, it'd be difficult to find 10 bands of their calibre. So you'd all pick 5, and then you'd be arguing about, oh, they're not quite good enough and things like that. So, why? Well, we've certainly lost all sponsorship. I don't know of a fully sponsored band anymore. I mean, for 5 years, my Leyland band became BNFL. It's like nuclear fuels, British nuclear fuels, and we were getting £100,000 a year from them. About 5 years, that's £500,000 we have. And in fact, we toured America about 4 times. We went to Korea, Japan, on the continent, and I'd take a 10-piece over to somewhere like France, where there was an exhibition of nuclear fuels and things like that, and we little group played. Of course, it attracted people to the stand. And wherever we went in America, there was a nuclear waste plant or something like that. They used to argue and laughed and said, BNFL means bad news for the locals. But we used to go over to America. And I remember the first time we went, we were in a place called Oak Ridge, Tennessee. And a beautiful old, like, rolling, lovely green hills and big wooden houses and bags of space. And there's this, like, well, they call it intersection, I think, but traffic lights. And you can't walk. You've got to wait for the lights to go before you can get across. And this guy's back, I said, wow, what a wonderful place, a beautiful place. You know what we're famous for? He said, no, we make the atom bomb here. And I thought, oh, that's why we're there. You see, so, because at one time we were actually playing at the British Embassy in Washington. And the ambassador came over to me and he said, you know why this is going on, don't you? And I said, no. He said, BNFL Inc., that was the American side of it, they've just signed a contract with the American government for $6 billion for 20 years to get rid of the nuclear waste. So that's why we were being sent there, to appease everybody. Like, and they said, oh, I don't like nuclear fuels. Oh, that's a nice band. And it worked that way. And they were giving us £100,000 a year. And he said it was worth £90,000 advertising. Because he said the stand banners were there on for quite a long time. And see, some people, but now, to be honest, it's a bit old-fashioned, a brass band, isn't it? And that's our own fault. We haven't moved forward. Some bands have, and some bands want to stay in tradition. I don't know how you feel about it. You're a good young mind, but if we're going to progress any further, we're going to have to change our ways.
How do you think that could be?
Well,
could be done?
In my opinion, see, we put far too much in these contests, and I think they're almost negative, because the best kind of contest, in my opinion, is an entertainment contest, and because otherwise we're isolating ourselves from the public. If we do content, because the public don't want to come and hear a piece 21 times, unfortunately, but it's our tradition, and we're traditionalists. Oh no! I mean, I quite love like adjudicating that, because it's easier to judge. Yes, you know what I mean. They're all playing the same thing, so you can compare. So, but if we want to connect with the public, we've got to do what the public want. And people usually say, I'm not going to a contest, I'm not going to pay £8 to listen to 21 times that. So we either change our ways or die that way. because I think that's how the dodo bird died. You know, it didn't adapt or something, get web feet or something like that. But too many traditionalists, which I'm a great traditionalist, and then the music that we're playing is not, in my opinion. See, we're playing that Moorside Suite. Well, I adore it, but it's not everybody's cup of tea. It's perhaps 1 foot in history. But Beethoven's music's still popular, isn't it? You know, you've got to think of it that way. So, I don't know the real answer, and I'm not sticking my neck out, but you can see what's happening. And yet, we've never had as many academies, have we? We've got Royal Northern, we've got Birmingham, we've got Salford, Huddersfield, and even the London and the Royal Welsh. And I think there's enough young brass players who would like to be in on that.
Okay, question 1 regarding the brass band scene in Northern Ireland and the standard of the bands. The brass band scene, I think, is very strong, I have to say, for a country this size. If we think across the sections, I mean, I've visited bands in your first division, second division, and third division, and in the first division, of course, we have the old boys, Laganvale, and the great work that's going on at Downshire. Of course, Michael Alcorn, coupled with his work at Queen's, doing an awful lot for banding in Northern Ireland. The old boys, of course, not just with their senior band, but with their youth band. Laganvale, I believe, also now have a youth band as well. So there's a very serious attempt by the best bands to foster their own players and nurture their own, as well as other players maybe wanting to play for them as their natural development leads them to that standard. One thing coupled with that I think that maybe could be thought about in Northern Ireland, and this maybe links with another question about holding on to players, is the idea that as players progress and their standard progresses, that maybe there's room for something within the rules that means they can still play for the bands, their first band, if you like, their roots, as well as playing for the likes of the old boys, Laganvale, Downshire, etc. So that there is room for development for the players, but also that a situation that development doesn't necessarily cause problems for the bands that maybe taught them and started them off in the first place. Number 2, what do you make of the youth setup for young players, for young brass players in Northern Ireland? Yeah, I think this is something that's I've just touched upon. Really, is getting better with senior bands creating their youth bands for young brass players. Of course, there's good work done, tremendous work done, in fact, and encouragement by Ivor Stevenson and Armagh with the Fodens Summer School, of course, which I'm heavily involved with. There's also good work being done by Stephen Crooks. He's doing something similar for a weekend, I think in Fermanagh, with some players from Leyland and Les Niche, who is living across there, of course, now. So all of that really helps the youngsters. In terms of the youth setup itself within Northern Ireland, I think it's great that there's the senior bands are setting up their own youth bands, and there are places for youngsters to play. I also think it's important that the sort of the Belfast School of Music, the Eastern Board, all the relative boards that provide instrumental tuition take banding seriously, because as an ensemble tool and a means of ensemble training, a brass band is of course excellent. And it's no coincidence, I don't think, if you look round the orchestral brass sections in the UK, that many of the players that are sitting in the orchestral brass sections in the professional orchestras around the UK have all had, or many of them have been, at some point in their lives, involved in playing in a brass band. And I don't think that's any small coincidence. that level of ensemble training and development has helped those musicians to become what they are. So I think that's something that all the boards should take very, very seriously. I maybe didn't finish the standard of the bands. If that question is related to where do I see the standard in terms of, as a comparison, for example, against the bands in the UK and the grading system in the mainland, the bands on the mainland, I should say, I would say that your first division is probably on a par with the mid to lower end of our championship section, and probably the top end of our first section on the mainland. I think, as was seen with St Magnus at the NIBA a few years ago, if a piece of the highest championship section status is set at the NIBA, it causes untold problems for the bands across. Of course, that's not to say something difficult shouldn't be set in order to push the standard forward. But if we're talking about a real like-for-like comparison, I would say that's probably fair. And your best second division bands, I mean, the great work that goes on by Desy Graham at Third Carrick in the second division, and of course Drogheda coming and challenging as strongly as they do whenever they take part, I would say is really mid to good first section standard on the mainland, and you can carry that analogy down through the sections really. But I think your panel of test piece selectors across do a very, very good job in pitching the pieces to the standard of the bands, and still producing a very worthy contest, and indeed a contest that still produces a result. So I would say that's probably the fairest indication and comparison to the standard on the mainland. And finally, you have, as a small country with limited professional brass opportunities, how do you think we could try and keep hold of our best players instead of moving to the mainland, and also strengthen the standard of the bands? I think I look at this maybe slightly differently, in that the travelling to the mainland actually is a good thing. I mean, we have many players on the mainland who then travel abroad to widen their experience and get different ideas and look to improve them forward. I think what's probably a more pertinent question would be how can we create a vibrant musical scene that players would want to come back to, having travelled and gained those other experiences. And I think maybe that's something that should be considered, keeping hold of the best players instead of them moving to the mainland. All comes down to education and opportunity. And of course, as I said, there's good educational things going on across in Northern Ireland. But I think letting people fly, gain experience, but having something interesting and vibrant to come back to, that's maybe what the country could look at in terms of people thinking, yeah, I want to go and get those experiences, but I want to come back and put something back in to the scene in the country. So that's maybe where I stand on question number 3. I hope all of that is useful, and hopefully, as well as being useful, maybe interesting and informative from my stance on what I've seen from my involvement across the past 6 or so years now with Northern Ireland banding.